The wind howled like a banshee across the empty parking lot, as Derek slammed the car door and shouted over the storm, "Maybe this will teach you to stop questioning every decision I make." The red taillights of our SUV disappeared into the wall of rain, leaving me standing alone at a gas station on Highway 98, with Hurricane Delilah bearing down on the Florida coast. What my husband didn't know was that abandoning me in the middle of a natural disaster would awaken something in me that had been dormant for 8 years. Something that would eventually put me in command of the very people he'd spend the next 6 months trying to impress at his corporate networking events. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The argument had started 3 hours earlier when Derek announced we were evacuating to his mother's house in Alabama instead of my sister's place in Georgia. I'd suggested we reconsider since meteorologists were predicting Delilah would shift eastward, potentially putting Alabama directly in the storm's path. Derek's jaw had tightened in that familiar way, his voice dropping to the condescending tone he'd perfected over our 8-year marriage. "Natalie, you work in logistics for a defense contractor, not meteorology. Let me handle the actual decision-making here." His words stung because they carried an uncomfortable grain of truth. I did work in logistics, coordinating supply chains and equipment transfers for Meridian Defense Solutions, but what Derek had never bothered to learn was that my job required me to track weather patterns, emergency protocols and evacuation procedures across multiple military installations. I'd been monitoring Delilah's projected path for days, running probability models that my former military training had taught me to interpret with deadly accuracy. That former military training was something Derek preferred to pretend didn't exist. When we'd met 9 years ago at a defense industry conference in Washington, D.C., I was transitioning out of the Army after 6 years of service. Derek, a rising star in corporate finance, had been charmed by what he called my unique background during our courtship. But as our relationship progressed toward marriage, my military experience became something he tolerated rather than celebrated. The confident soldier who'd completed advanced tactical training and served 2 deployments gradually morphed into the accommodating wife who deferred to her husband's judgment on everything from dinner plans to career decisions. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. It started with small comments about my intensity and suggestions that I might want to soften my approach in social situations. Derek would laugh off my strategic thinking as overthinking, and redirect conversations when I shared stories from my service year. Slowly, I learned to keep those parts of myself hidden, to speak more quietly, to second-guess instincts that had once kept me and my team alive in hostile territory. But standing in that gas station parking lot with hurricane-force winds threatening to knock me off my feet, 8 years of suppressed military training suddenly surged back to life. My situational awareness kicked in immediately. The gas station's emergency lighting flickered ominously, indicating potential power grid instability. The absence of other vehicles suggested most rational people had already evacuated. The wind patterns and the decreasing barometric pressure I could feel in my bones told me we had maybe 2 hours before conditions became truly life-threatening. I pulled out my phone to call Derek, but the screen showed no signal. Cell towers in the area were either down or overloaded. The gas station's landline had a dial tone, but Derek wasn't answering his phone anyway. I tried calling my sister in Georgia, my parents in Colorado, even Derek's mother in Alabama. Nothing went through. The gas station attendant, a nervous-looking young man named Carlos, was boarding up the last window when he noticed me standing by the phone. "Ma'am, you need to get out of here. We're closing down and evacuating. You got somewhere to go." I explained my situation as briefly as possible, watching his expression shift from confusion to concern to something approaching panic. "Your husband just left you here, in this storm. That's messed up, late. Look, I can give you a ride to the emergency shelter in Pensacola, but we gotta leave now. The bridges are gonna close within the hour." The emergency shelter. I'd read about Hurricane Delilah's projected impact on the shelter system during my morning briefings at work. The Pensacola shelter was already at capacity, housing families from the barrier islands and coastal communities. Adding another person would strain resources that were already stretched thin. More importantly, something in my gut told me that running to a shelter wasn't the right move. I needed to think strategically, not reactively. "Thank you, Carlos, but I'm going to figure out another option." You get yourself somewhere safe. He looked at me like I'd lost my mind, but the urgency of his own evacuation won out over his concern for a stranger. Within minutes, his pickup truck disappeared into the storm, leaving me truly alone for the first time since Derek had driven away. Standing in the relative shelter of the gas station's covered area, I forced myself to think like the soldier I used to be rather than the accommodating wife I'd become. Resources. I had my purse with my wallet, phone and keys to a house Derek had already abandoned. Skills. 8 years might have dulled my edge, but my tactical training, crisis management experience and survival instincts were still there, buried under years of suburban comfort. Mission: survive the next 48 hours and figure out what came next. The first priority was shelter. Our house was only 12 miles inland, built to newer hurricane codes with impact-resistant windows and a safe room Derek had installed primarily to impress his insurance agent. The storm surge wouldn't reach that far inland, and the structure could handle the wind load from a Category 3 hurricane, but getting there on foot in these conditions would be suicide, and no ride-sharing services were operating during a mandatory evacuation. That's when I remembered the emergency management office maintained a list of emergency personnel who remained in the area during storms. As a defense contractor with security clearance, I had access to communication channels that civilians typically couldn't reach. My work phone, issued by Meridian Defense Solutions, had satellite capability for exactly these kinds of scenarios. I pulled out the ruggedized device and activated the emergency communication protocol I'd never actually used in the field. The satellite connection took nearly 5 minutes to establish, but finally I heard a voice on the other end. Emergency Operations Center, this is Command Sergeant Major Rodriguez. State your emergency. Ma'am, this is Natalie Harper, Logistics Coordinator with Meridian Defense Solutions. I'm stranded at the Gulf Point gas station on Highway 98 during the evacuation. I need advisement on available emergency transportation or shelter options. There was a pause on the other end, and I heard the sound of keyboard typing. Miss Harper, I'm showing your security clearance in the system. What's your current tactical assessment of the situation? The question surprised me. Emergency operators typically didn't ask civilians for tactical assessments, but something in the woman's tone suggested she was taking me more seriously than I'd expected. I found myself responding with the kind of detailed situational report I hadn't given in 8 years. Ma'am, I've got approximately 90 minutes before this position becomes untenable. Wind speeds are approaching the threshold for structural damage to the gas station facility. No civilian transportation available, and emergency services have already pulled back to safe zones. I'm equipped for limited movement, but not extended exposure to hurricane conditions. Copy that. What's your background, Harper? 6 years Army, ma'am. Logistics and tactical operations. Separated in 2016. Another pause, longer this time. Harper, I'm looking at a situation that might interest you. We've got a contract team operating out of Fort Liberty running hurricane response training. They're always looking for experienced personnel to fill out their training scenario. The pay is good, and it would get you out of immediate danger. You interested in some temporary work? The offer caught me completely off guard. I'd spent the last 8 years in a civilian job that used my military background, but never challenged me the way actual operations have. The thought of working with a tactical team again, even in a training capacity, sent a surge of excitement through me that I hadn't felt in years. Ma'am, I'd need transportation to Fort Liberty, and I'd need to notify my employer about a temporary reassignment. Transportation's not a problem. We've got a helicopter extraction scheduled for essential personnel in your area in about 40 minutes. As for your employer, Meridian Defense Solutions has contracts with half the training programs on the East Coast. Consider this a professional development opportunity. Professional development opportunity. The phrase made me smile for the first time since Derek had driven away. Maybe this disaster was about to become something else entirely. Command Sergeant Major Rodriguez continued. Harper, there's a parking area behind the gas station that should provide adequate clearance for helicopter landing. Can you secure that area and establish a landing zone? Roger that, ma'am. I'll mark the LZ and be ready for extraction. As I hung up the phone, something fundamental shifted inside me. For the first time in 8 years, Someone was asking me to use my actual skills rather than hide them. Someone was treating me like the competent professional I'd once been rather than the diminished version of myself I'd become in my marriage. The next 40 minutes passed quickly as I fell back into procedures I'd thought I'd forgot. I used emergency flares from the gas station's safety kit to mark a clear landing zone, checked the area for debris and obstacles, and established communication protocols with the incoming aircraft. When the helicopter appeared through the storm, its rotors cutting through the wind and rain with mechanical precision, I felt more like myself than I had in years. The crew chief who helped me aboard was a woman about my age with the kind of confident competence I recognized immediately. "You Harper," she shouted over the engine noise. "That's me. I'm Specialist Cross. Rodriguez says you've got tactical experience. We're gonna put that to good use where we're going." As the helicopter lifted off from the gas station parking lot, I watched the Florida coast disappear beneath the storm clouds. Somewhere down there, Derek was probably explaining to his mother how his unreasonable wife had refused to follow his evacuation plan. He had no idea that his decision to abandon me in a parking lot was about to launch me into the most challenging and rewarding work I'd done since leaving the Army. The flight to Fort Liberty took 2 hours, cutting across the storm's edge and into calmer skies over North Carolina. Specialist Cross briefed me on the training program during the flight. The Defense Advanced Training Initiative was a joint program between active military units and private contractors, designed to simulate real-world crisis scenarios using experienced personnel from both sectors. Participants rotated through different specializations, from logistics and communications to tactical operations and emergency response. "Most people do a 6-month rotation," Cross explained, "but we've had some folks extend that when they find their niche. The pay's competitive, and the experience looks great on your resume if you're thinking about transitioning back to military contracting." Transitioning back to military contracting. The phrase hung in the air as I considered possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to imagine in years. Derek had always dismissed any suggestion that I might want to do more challenging work, arguing that our lifestyle required the stability of my current position. But sitting in that helicopter, watching the landscape change from storm-devastated coast to secure military installation, I began to wonder what my life might look like if I made decisions based on my own capabilities rather than Derek's comfort level. Fort Liberty appeared ahead of us just as the sun broke through the clouds for the first time in hours. The sprawling installation looked exactly like the dozen other military bases I'd called home during my 6 years of service. But somehow it felt different this time. Instead of the anxiety I'd felt as a young soldier trying to prove herself, I felt the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was capable of. The helicopter touched down on a landing pad adjacent to a series of modern training facilities. As I gathered my minimal belongings and prepared to step back into the world I'd left 8 years ago, my phone buzzed with a text message. Derek had finally noticed that cell service was restored. "Nat, where are you? Mom's house was in the storm path after all. You were right about the weather. Call me." I stared at the message for a long moment, then turned off the phone without responding. For the first time in 8 years, Derek's need to control the narrative would have to wait. I had work to do. The barracks at Fort Liberty smelled like industrial disinfectant and possibility. My assigned quarters were Spartan but functional, a far cry from the carefully decorated suburban home I'd shared with Derek for the past 5 years. The single bed with its regulation olive drab blanket, the metal desk bolted to the wall, and the small closet that could hold exactly 6 uniforms reminded me of who I used to be before I'd learned to apologize for taking up space. Command Sergeant Major Patricia Rodriguez knocked on my door at 05:30 hours, exactly 12 hours after my helicopter extraction from the gas station. I'd managed maybe 3 hours of sleep, my mind racing between relief at being safe and disbelief at the complete upheaval of my life in a single day. "Harper, you ready to see what we do here?" Rodriguez was a compact woman in her mid-40s with steel gray hair pulled back in a regulation bun, and eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of her surroundings. Her handshake was firm without being aggressive, and she carried herself with the kind of easy authority that came from decades of earning respect rather than demanding it. "Yes, ma'am," though I should probably mention I haven't been in a tactical environment for 8 years. I might be a little rusty, Rodriguez smiled, the first genuinely warm expression I'd seen from her. Harper, you established a helicopter landing zone in hurricane conditions, using gas station emergency flares and maintained radio protocol with an incoming aircraft while under extreme stress. Trust me, you're not as rusty as you think. She led me through a maze of corridors to a briefing room where 15 other people sat around a rectangular table. The group was a mix of active-duty military personnel and civilians, their ages ranging from mid-20s to early 50s. What struck me immediately was the energy in the room, an undercurrent of focused intensity that I remembered from my Army days, but hadn't experienced in my civilian job. People, this is Natalie Harper. She's joining us from Meridian Defense Solutions, and brings 6 years of Army logistics and tactical operations experience. Harper, meet your team for the next phase of training. The introductions that followed revealed the diverse backgrounds of the group. Lieutenant Colonel James Mackenzie, the team leader, had spent 15 years in Special Forces before transitioning to training roles. Dr. Sarah Kim was a civilian emergency medicine specialist who consulted on medical protocols for high-risk operations. Technical Sergeant Williams brought expertise in communications and electronic warfare. Each person represented a different piece of a complex puzzle, and I began to understand that this wasn't just military training but something much more comprehensive. Mackenzie leaned back in his chair and studied me with the kind of measured assessment I remembered from my first days in the Army. Harper, what's your experience with crisis response in civilian environments? Sir, my current position involves coordinating emergency supply chains for military installations affected by natural disasters, equipment failures, or security incidents. I've managed logistics for hurricane response, wildfire evacuations, and infrastructure failures across 6 states over the past 4 years. Interesting, and your tactical background? 6 years Army, sir. 2 deployments to Afghanistan with the 25th Infantry Division, specialized in convoy operations, base security, and emergency evacuation procedure. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Dr. Kim leaned forward, her expression curious. What brought you from active duty to civilian logistics? The question hit closer to home than I'd expected. I found myself hesitating, unsure how much personal detail was appropriate in this setting. Personal circumstances, ma'am. Got married and wanted to establish a more stable lifestyle. Rodriguez and Mackenzie exchanged a glance that told me they'd heard similar stories before. The military was full of capable people who'd left service for relationships that ultimately required them to become smaller versions of themselves. The difference was that most of those people never got a chance to find their way back to who they'd been before they started making compromises. Well, whatever brought you here, you're here now, Mackenzie said. We're starting a new training cycle focused on coordinated emergency response in complex environments. Think Hurricane Katrina, but with additional security threats and infrastructure challenges. Your civilian experience gives you perspectives most of us don't have. The training schedule Rodriguez handed me looked like nothing I'd encountered in my previous military service. Days started at 0500 with physical conditioning that incorporated obstacle courses, endurance challenges, and team-building exercises designed to push participants beyond their comfort zones. Mornings were dedicated to tactical training, covering everything from small unit operations to hostage rescue scenarios. Afternoons focused on specialized skills, communications, medical response, logistics coordination, and emergency engineering. But what made the program unique was its integration of civilian scenarios with military protocols. We'd spend a morning learning room-clearing techniques, then apply those skills to evacuating civilians from a damaged hospital. We'd practice convoy operations in the morning, then organize supply distribution to disaster refugees in the afternoon. The training forced us to think beyond traditional military objectives and consider the complex needs of civilian populations in crisis situations. My first week was humbling in ways I hadn't anticipated. My body, accustomed to desk work and occasional gym sessions, protested loudly against the physical demands of military training. My first attempt at the obstacle course left me gasping and far behind the rest of the team. Basic marksmanship, once second nature, required conscious effort to achieve acceptable accuracy. Even simple tasks like field stripping and cleaning weapons took me twice as long as they should have. But alongside the physical challenges came awakening of capabilities I'd forgotten I possessed. During a communications exercise, I identified a frequency conflict that was causing mission-critical interference, solving a problem that had stumped the rest of the team for hours. In a logistics simulation, I reorganized supply distribution protocols to increase efficiency by 30% while reducing resource waste. When Doc Kim needed someone to coordinate medical evacuation during a multi-casualty scenario, I found myself naturally falling into a leadership role that felt both familiar and energizing. Specialist Amanda Cross, the crew chief who'd helped extract me from the hurricane, became my closest ally during those early weeks. Amanda was 5 years younger than me but had more recent tactical experience, having completed 3 combat deployments with an Army aviation unit before joining the training program. She had the kind of easy confidence that came from knowing exactly what she was capable of, but without the arrogance that sometimes accompanied such competence. "You know what your problem is, Harp," Amanda said one evening as we cleaned our weapons after a particularly challenging day of urban warfare simulations. "You keep apologizing for being good at things. What do you mean?" Today, during the hostage rescue scenario, you identified the optimal breach point, coordinated with the sniper team, and managed civilian evacuation simultaneously. But every time Mackenzie complimented your performance, you deflected with some comment about being rusty or lucky. "Stop doing that." Her observation struck me as uncomfortably accurate. I'd spent 8 years with Derek learning to downplay my achievements, to make my successes smaller so they wouldn't overshadow his insecurity. The habit was so ingrained that I was doing it unconsciously, even in an environment where competence was valued rather than threatening. "It's hard to break old habits," I admitted, "then break them faster, because this program isn't about being modest or accommodating. It's about being the best version of yourself so you can help other people when everything goes wrong." Amanda's words stayed with me as the training intensified during my second month. We moved from basic scenarios to complex, multi-day exercises that tested every aspect of our ability. One particularly challenging simulation involved responding to a Category 5 hurricane that had damaged a nuclear power facility while terrorist groups attempted to exploit the chaos. My role was coordinating logistics for 3 separate response teams while maintaining communication with civilian authorities and federal agencies. The exercise pushed me harder than anything I'd experienced in my previous military service. For 18 hours straight, I managed supply chains, tracked personnel movements, coordinated air and ground transportation, and adapted plans in real time as the scenario evolved. When equipment failures disrupted our primary communication network, I established backup protocols using satellite phones and emergency radio frequencies. When one of our helicopters developed mechanical problems, I reorganized the entire transportation schedule to maintain mission timeline. At the end of the exercise, Mackenzie pulled me aside for a debrief that I expected to focus on areas for improvement. Instead, he surprised me with an assessment that made me question everything I thought I knew about my own capability. "Harper, that was the most effective logistics coordination I've seen in 15 years of running these exercises. You managed 3 separate crises simultaneously, while adapting to changing conditions faster than our planning staff could update the scenario. Have you considered applying for the advanced program?" "Advanced program, sir?" "It's a 6-month intensive that prepares experienced personnel for leadership roles in high-risk civilian contract work. Think disaster response, humanitarian missions, corporate security consulting. The pay is significantly better than most civilian positions, and the work is exactly the kind of challenge you seem built for." The suggestion opened possibilities I hadn't allowed myself to consider. For 8 years I'd accepted Derek's assertion that my military background was a phase I'd outgrown, something to be managed rather than leveraged. But standing in that briefing room, receiving recognition for capabilities I'd forgotten I possessed, I began to imagine a future that looked completely different from the suburban life I'd left behind in Florida. That evening, I called Derek for the first time since arriving at Fort Liberty. The conversation was awkward from the beginning, filled with the kind of stilted small talk that suggested we were both avoiding larger issues. Nat, when are you coming home? I've been handling everything here by myself, and frankly, it's not sustainable long term. I'm not sure yet. This training program is more intensive than I expected, and there might be opportunities for extended work. Extended work? What kind of extended work? I tried to explain the advanced program and the potential for leadership roles in emergency response contracting, but Derek's responses made it clear he viewed my enthusiasm as temporary insanity. Natalie, you have a good job here. We have a life here. You can't just abandon everything because you're having some kind of midlife crisis adventure. It's not a midlife crisis, Derek. It's remembering what I'm actually capable of. What you're capable of is being my wife and maintaining the life we've built together. This military fantasy is exactly the kind of thinking that got you stuck at a gas station in a hurricane. His words stung because they revealed how little he understood about what had actually happened. In Derek's version of events, my abandonment at the gas station was the natural consequence of my poor judgment rather than his deliberate cruelty. The hurricane extraction wasn't evidence of my resourcefulness, but proof of my inability to handle normal situations. I have to go, Derek. We'll talk more later. Nat, I'm serious about this. You need to come home soon and stop playing soldier. I hung up without responding, but his words echoed in my mind as I tried to fall asleep. Playing soldier. The phrase dismissed everything I was rediscovering about myself as childish fantasy rather than legitimate capability. For 8 years I'd accepted Derek's interpretation of my worth, allowing him to define the boundaries of what I was allowed to want from my life. But 3 months of intensive training had reminded me of something important. I wasn't playing soldier. I was a soldier who'd forgotten how to be one until circumstances forced me to remember. The advanced program Mackenzie had mentioned was scheduled to begin in 2 weeks, with only 8 slots available for the 15 people in our current training cycle. Selection was based on performance evaluations, peer recommendations, and leadership potential demonstrated during exercises. I'd never wanted anything more in my life, but applying meant acknowledging that I might not return to Florida for months, possibly longer. Rodriguez found me in the equipment bay the next morning, methodically cleaning my rifle with the kind of focused attention to detail that indicated deeper preoccupation. Harper, you're thinking too hard about something. Want to talk it through? Ma'am, I'm considering applying for the advanced program, but it would mean extending my time here significantly. I'm not sure how to handle the personal implications. Rodriguez nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. You married, Harper? Yes, ma'am. 8 years. He's supportive of your career. The question was simple, but answering it honestly required me to confront truths I'd been avoiding for years. Not exactly, ma'am. He prefers me in more traditional roles. Traditional role. Rodriguez repeated the phrase with the kind of skeptical tone that suggested she'd heard similar stories before. Let me ask you something, Harper. If your husband supported your goals and encouraged your professional development, would you still be hesitating about this opportunity? No, ma'am. I'd already have submitted my application. Then maybe the question isn't whether you should apply for advanced training. Maybe the question is whether you want to spend the rest of your life making yourself smaller to accommodate someone who doesn't want you to grow. Her words crystallized thoughts I'd been circling around for weeks. The version of myself that Derek had fallen in love with 9 years ago was a transitional figure, a soldier becoming a civilian, a woman figuring out what came next. But the version of myself he'd married was static, defined by his needs rather than my potential. Over 8 years I'd gradually accepted his limitations as my own, allowing his discomfort with my capabilities to become my reality. Ma'am, what if I apply and it changes everything? Rodriguez smiled with the kind of knowing expression that suggested she'd faced similar crossroads in her own life. Harper, everything changed the moment you chose to establish that landing zone instead of waiting for someone to rescue you. The advanced program is just making that change official. I submitted my application that afternoon, attaching performance evaluations, peer recommendations, and a personal statement that felt like the first honest assessment of my goals I'd written in years. The process of articulating why I wanted the opportunity forced me to confront how much I'd changed during my 3 months at Fort Liberty. The woman who'd been abandoned at a gas station had been dependent, accommodating, and uncertain of her own judgment. The woman applying for advanced tactical training was confident, capable, and clear about her professional objectives. The transformation hadn't happened overnight, but it was undeniable nonetheless. 2 days later, Rodriguez posted the selection results on the training bulletin board. My name appeared third on the list of 8 candidates accepted for the advanced program. Standing in that corridor, surrounded by congratulations from teammates who'd become genuine friends, I felt a surge of pride and accomplishment that had been missing from my life for years. But alongside the celebration came the sobering recognition that accepting this opportunity would fundamentally alter the trajectory of my life. I couldn't complete 6 months of advanced training and return to my previous existence unchanged. The question was whether I was ready to embrace that transformation completely, including its implications for a marriage that suddenly seemed based on outdated assumptions about who I was supposed to be. That evening, I called Derek again, this time with news that would force both of us to confront the reality of how much had changed since Hurricane Delilah had blown through our lives. Derek, I was accepted into an advanced training program. It's a significant professional opportunity, but it means staying at Fort Liberty for another 6 months. The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that I wondered if the call had dropped. When Derek finally responded, his voice carried a coldness I'd never heard before. 6 months, Natalie. You've lost your mind. You're throwing away our marriage for some military fantasy that isn't even real employment. It is real employment, Derek. The program leads to consulting positions with major defense contractors. The starting salary is nearly double what I make now. I don't care about the money. I care about my wife coming home and acting like a normal person instead of pretending she's some kind of action hero. Action hero. Another dismissive phrase that revealed how little Derek understood about what I was actually doing. The training wasn't about fantasy fulfillment, but about developing skills that could save lives in emergency situations. The work wasn't about personal gratification but about serving communities when their normal support systems failed. This is who I am, Derek. It's who I was before we got married, and it's who I'm becoming again. No, this is who you're pretending to be because you're having some kind of breakdown. The Natalie I married understood priorities and responsibility. The Natalie you married gave up everything that mattered to her to become the person you wanted. I'm done doing that. The conversation deteriorated from there, ending with Derek issuing an ultimatum that felt both inevitable and liberating. Choose, Natalie. Come home within the month and be my wife, or stay there and be alone. I hung up without giving him an answer, but in my heart, the choice had already been made. The woman who'd been abandoned at a gas station during a hurricane might have been devastated by that ultimatum. The woman who'd spent 3 months rediscovering her capabilities recognized it as permission to finally be honest about what she wanted from her life. 6 months of advanced training stretched ahead of me like an open road to possibilities I was only beginning to imagine. For the first time in 8 years, the future felt like something I was creating rather than something happening to me, and Derek's ultimatum, designed to control my decision, had accidentally given me the freedom to choose myself. The advanced program began at dawn on a Monday that felt like the first day of my real life. 8 of us stood in formation outside the specialized training facility, a complex of buildings designed to simulate everything from urban warfare environments to disaster-stricken hospitals. The morning air carried the scent of pine trees and possibility, and for the first time in years, I woke up excited about what the day would bring. Lieutenant Colonel Mackenzie addressed us with the kind of straightforward intensity that left no room for doubt about the seriousness of what we were undertaking. For the next 6 months, you'll be pushed beyond anything you've experienced in standard military training. This program isn't about following orders or completing checklists. It's about developing the judgment and leadership skills necessary to make life or death decisions when there's no manual to follow and no backup coming. The first month focused on advanced tactical operations in complex environments. We spent weeks learning to clear buildings while accounting for civilian populations, conducting hostage negotiations while managing multiple security threats, and coordinating emergency medical response in hostile territory. Every scenario was designed to test our ability to think strategically while executing tactically, to balance competing priorities while maintaining mission focus. My logistics background proved invaluable in ways I hadn't anticipated. While other team members excelled at direct action scenarios, I found myself naturally gravitating toward the coordination and planning elements that made successful operations possible. During a particularly challenging exercise involving the evacuation of a hospital under siege, I managed resource allocation for 3 separate extraction teams while maintaining communication with civilian authorities and coordinating air support. The exercise required 18 hours of continuous operation, with scenarios evolving in real time based on our decisions and performance. When our primary communication network was compromised by simulated electronic warfare, I established backup protocols using emergency frequencies and hand signals. When medical supplies ran low during a mass casualty event, I reorganized distribution priorities to maximize life-saving potential while preparing for supply resupply. When weather conditions grounded our evacuation helicopters, I coordinated ground transportation through hostile territory while adapting security protocols. Dr. Kim, who'd been observing the exercise from the operations center, pulled me aside during a brief break between scenarios. "Natalie, where did you learn to coordinate multiple crisis responses simultaneous like that?" "I'm not sure, ma'am. It just feels natural to see how all the pieces fit together. That kind of strategic thinking isn't natural. It's a skill that usually takes years to develop, and most people never achieve that level of integration." "Have you considered specializing in crisis management consulting?" Crisis management consulting was a field I'd never seriously considered, despite my current job involving emergency logistics. The work Kim described involved deploying to disaster zones, coordinating response efforts for major corporations during security incidents, and managing evacuation operations for humanitarian organizations in unstable regions. It was challenging, well-compensated work that required exactly the kind of strategic thinking and tactical flexibility I was discovering I possessed. What would that kind of career path look like? After this program, you'd qualify for positions with firms like Blackstone Security Solutions or Global Crisis Management. Starting salaries are typically in the 6-figure range, with significant bonuses for complex deployments. More importantly, it's work that matters. You'd be helping communities recover from disasters, protecting people during emergencies, and coordinating response efforts when government systems break down. The conversation planted seeds that grew throughout the second month of training. We moved from tactical scenarios to comprehensive crisis management exercises that simulated everything from natural disasters to terrorist attacks to industrial accidents. My role evolved from participant to team leader, coordinating operations that involved dozens of personnel and multiple agencies. During one particularly intense simulation, we responded to a simulated chemical plant explosion that had contaminated a significant area while triggering evacuations across 3 counties. My responsibility was coordinating the overall response while managing competing priorities from environmental agencies, law enforcement, medical teams, and civilian authorities. The exercise lasted 4 days and required me to make decisions that affected thousands of simulated civilians while working with incomplete information and changing conditions. The debrief after that exercise marked a turning point in how I understood my own capability. McKinsey reviewed my performance with the kind of detailed analysis typically reserved for mission-critical operations. "Harper, you managed 17 different agencies across 4 days of crisis response while adapting to 6 major scenario changes. Your resource allocation decisions maximized life-saving potential while minimizing environmental damage. Your communication protocols kept all stakeholders informed without overwhelming decision-makers with unnecessary detail. Most importantly, your leadership style brought out the best performance from every team you worked with." Amanda Cross, who'd served as my deputy during the exercise, nodded emphatically. "Natalie, people trust you immediately. You have this way of making complex situations feel manageable without minimizing the real challenges. That's not a skill you can teach. The recognition felt surreal after years of having my judgment questioned and my capabilities dismissed. In Derek's world, my tendency to see strategic connections and anticipate problems was overthinking or being negative. In this environment, those same qualities were valuable leadership traits that made complex operations successful. Rodriguez approached me after the debrief with an opportunity that seemed too good to be real. "Harper, I've been in contact with Global Crisis Management about their leadership development program. They're looking for experienced personnel who can transition from military backgrounds to civilian consulting roles. The compensation package is substantial, and the work involves exactly the kind of strategic coordination you've been excelling at here." Global Crisis Management was one of the premier firms in the field, with contracts spanning everything from corporate security to disaster response to humanitarian missions. Their leadership development program was highly competitive, accepting only a handful of candidates each year for intensive training, followed by guaranteed placement in senior consulting roles. What would the timeline look like? You'd finish this program, then spend 3 months in specialized training with GCM. After that, you'd be placed in a senior consultant role with starting compensation around $150,000 annually, plus performance bonuses and deployment premium. More importantly, you'd be working on missions that actually matter. The opportunity represented everything I'd lost when I'd transitioned out of the military 8 years earlier: challenging work that utilized my skills, recognition for my capabilities, and compensation that reflected my value. It also represented a complete break from the life I'd built with Derek, a point of no return that would make reconciliation impossible even if I wanted to pursue it. That evening, I called my sister Rachel for the first time since the hurricane. Rachel was 3 years older than me and had built a successful career as an emergency room physician in Atlanta. She'd never particularly liked Derek, though she'd been diplomatically supportive of my marriage, until the day he'd abandoned me at the gas station. "Nat, I've been worried sick about you. Derek called me 2 weeks ago asking if I'd heard from you, and he sounded absolutely furious." "I'm fine, Rachel. Better than fine, actually. I'm doing work that challenges me for the first time in years." I described the training program and the opportunity with Global Crisis Management, watching my sister's expression shift from concern to excitement as she realized how much I'd changed in just a few months. "This sounds incredible now. You're obviously thriving in a way I haven't seen since before you got married. But what about Derek? What about your life in Florida?" "Derek gave me an ultimatum: come home and be his wife, or stay here and be alone." Rachel's expression hardened in a way I recognized from our childhood, when she'd appointed herself my protector against playground bullies and unfair teachers. "He said you'd be alone." That was his exact phrase. "Nat, you're not alone. You have family who love you, colleagues who respect you, and opportunities that excite you. Derek's the one who's going to be alone when you realize you don't need him to have a meaningful life." My sister's words crystallized something I'd been thinking about for weeks. Derek's ultimatum was based on the assumption that I needed him more than he needed me, that my fear of being alone would ultimately override my desire for professional fulfillment. But 4 months of intensive training had reminded me that I was capable of building relationships, succeeding professionally, and finding purpose without his permission or participation. The 3rd month of training introduced international scenarios that required us to work with foreign military units, civilian agencies, and humanitarian organizations. We spent 2 weeks at a NATO training facility in Virginia, coordinating joint operations with personnel from 12 different countries. The cultural complexity added layers of challenge that tested every aspect of our communication and leadership skills. My role during the international exercises was coordinating logistics and communications for a multinational humanitarian mission in a simulated post-conflict environment. The scenario involved delivering medical supplies and establishing refugee processing centers while coordinating with peacekeeping forces and local civilian authorities. Every decision required balancing competing national interests, cultural sensitivities, and operational constraints. The exercise culminated in a crisis that tested everything we'd learned about leadership under pressure. A simulated terrorist attack on one of our supply convoys triggered a complex emergency response that required coordinating medical evacuation, security response, and continued humanitarian operations, while managing international media attention and diplomatic concerns. For 6 hours, I managed operations that involved over 100 personnel from 8 different nations, while adapting to constantly changing conditions. When communication systems failed, I established backup protocols using multiple languages and cultural liaisons. When political tensions threatened to derail the mission, I coordinated with diplomatic representatives to maintain operational focus. When medical emergencies overwhelmed our capabilities, I reorganized resource allocation to prioritize life-saving intervention. The after-action review included assessments from senior officers from all participating nations. Colonel Sarah Martinez, the Spanish liaison who'd observed my performance throughout the exercise, approached me with feedback that reinforced my growing confidence in my leadership abilities. Ms. Harper, your coordination of that crisis response was exceptional. You managed to maintain operational effectiveness while respecting cultural differences and diplomatic sensitivities. Those skills are exactly what international humanitarian organizations need in senior leadership positions. Colonel Martinez's words opened another possibility I hadn't considered. International humanitarian work would combine my tactical training with meaningful service to communities affected by disasters, conflicts, and poverty. Organizations like Doctors Without Borders, the International Red Cross, and the United Nations relied on experienced logistics and operations specialists to coordinate complex missions in challenging environments. What would that kind of career path involve? Deployments to disaster zones, conflict areas, and regions affected by humanitarian crises. The work is demanding but incredibly rewarding. You'd be coordinating relief operations, managing security for medical teams, and ensuring that aid reaches the people who need it most. The compensation is competitive, and the personal satisfaction is unmatched. As the training program entered its final months, I found myself with multiple career options that seemed almost impossible to believe after years of feeling professionally stagnated. Global Crisis Management had extended a formal offer for their leadership development program. International humanitarian organizations had expressed interest in my combination of tactical skills and strategic thinking. Even traditional defense contractors were recruiting me for senior positions that involved exactly the kind of complex coordination work I'd discovered I loved. More importantly, I was surrounded by colleagues who valued my contributions and challenged me to continue growing. Amanda Cross had become a close friend whose tactical expertise complemented my strategic thinking. Dr. Kim served as an informal mentor who helped me understand the broader applications of my skill. Rodriguez continued to provide guidance on career decisions while respecting my autonomy to choose my own path. The community I'd found at Fort Liberty felt more genuine than any social circle I'd been part of during my marriage. These were people who knew me as a competent professional rather than as Derek's accommodating wife. They encouraged my ambitions rather than limiting them, and they celebrated my successes without feeling threatened by my achievement. During the 4th month of training, we participated in a capstone exercise that simulated a major earthquake affecting a densely populated urban area. The scenario required coordinating response efforts across multiple jurisdictions while managing resource constraints, communication failures, and ongoing aftershocks that continued to threaten responders and civilians. My role was serving as operations commander for the overall response effort, coordinating activities of search and rescue teams, medical units, engineering specialists, and civilian agencies. The exercise lasted 5 days and required me to make strategic decisions that affected thousands of simulated casualties while adapting to constantly evolving conditions. On the 3rd day of the exercise, a major aftershock triggered a simulated building collapse that trapped dozens of civilians and several response team members. The incident required immediate tactical response while maintaining strategic oversight of the broader operation. I had to coordinate rescue efforts for the trapped personnel while ensuring that other response activities continued without interruption. The rescue operation required 12 hours of continuous coordination, during which I managed resource allocation between multiple crisis sites, coordinated medical evacuation for mass casualties, and maintained communication with civilian authorities and federal agencies. When specialized rescue equipment malfunctioned, I improvised solutions using available resources and alternative techniques. When medical supplies ran low, I coordinated emergency resupply while reorganizing treatment priorities to maximize life-saving potential. The successful resolution of the exercise earned recognition that surprised even me. Mackenzie's final assessment described my performance as exceptional leadership under extreme pressure and recommended me for advancement to instructor positions within the program. Dr. Kim noted my unique ability to maintain strategic perspective while managing tactical crises. Even the civilian observers from various emergency management agencies commented on my effectiveness in coordinating multi-agency response efforts. But the recognition that meant the most came from my teammates, the people who'd worked alongside me through months of challenging scenarios and high-pressure exercise. During our final team meeting, Amanda Cross presented me with a small plaque that read, "Outstanding Leadership, Fort Liberty Advanced Training Program," signed by all 7 of my teammates. "Natalie, you made all of us better at what we do," Amanda said. "You have this gift for seeing how everything connects and helping people understand their role in the bigger picture. Don't ever let anyone convince you that those skills aren't valuable." As the program entered its final weeks, I realized I'd become a fundamentally different person than the woman who'd been abandoned at a gas station 6 months earlier. The transformation wasn't just professional but personal, affecting how I understood my own worth and what I was willing to accept from relationships and career opportunities. The woman Derek had married might have been intimidated by the career options now available to me. She might have worried about whether pursuing challenging work would threaten her marriage or make her less appealing as a partner. But the woman completing advanced tactical training understood that relationships based on limiting my potential weren't worth preserving, regardless of their history or social expectations. Global Crisis Management had scheduled my final interview for the week after program completion. The position they were offering involved senior-level consulting work with starting compensation nearly 3 times what I'd been earning in my previous job. More importantly, it represented the kind of challenging, meaningful work I'd been craving without knowing it existed. But accepting that position would require making permanent the break with Derek that had been evolving over 6 months of minimal contact. It would mean acknowledging that the marriage I'd tried to preserve for 8 years was incompatible with the person I'd become. It would mean choosing growth over comfort, possibility over security, and authenticity over accommodation. 2 weeks before the program's conclusion, Derek called me for what would turn out to be our final conversation as husband and wife. His tone carried a mixture of frustration and desperation that suggested he was finally realizing the gravity of changes he'd initially dismissed as temporary rebellion. "Natalie, this has gone on long enough. I've been patient with this military phase you're going through, but it's time to come home and rebuild our marriage. Derek, this isn't a phase, this is my career now. I've been offered positions that will utilize my skills and challenge me professionally in ways I haven't experienced since leaving the Army. Your skills, Natalie, your skills are being my wife and managing our household. This fantasy about being some kind of crisis management expert isn't real life." His words crystallized everything that had been wrong with our marriage for years. Derek genuinely believed that my most valuable contributions were domestic and social, that my professional capabilities were secondary to my role as his supportive partner. He couldn't conceive of a version of our relationship where my career ambitions were equally important to his comfort and preferences. "Derek, I've spent 6 months working with some of the most experienced tactical and emergency management professionals in the country. I've been offered positions with major consulting firms based on demonstrated performance in complex crisis scenarios. This isn't fantasy, it's recognition of capabilities I've always had, but never been encouraged to develop. Recognition from whom? Military trainers who are filling your head with unrealistic expectations. Natalie, you're a logistics coordinator, not a crisis management expert. I'm whatever I choose to become, and I choose to become someone who uses her skills to help people during emergencies, rather than someone who limits herself to accommodate her husband's insecurities." The conversation deteriorated from there, ending with Derek issuing a final ultimatum that felt more like liberation than threat. Choose, Natalie, come home now and recommit to our marriage, or I'm filing for divorce and moving on with my life. I understand, Derek, do what you need to do. I hung up without providing the answer he expected, but in my heart the choice had been made months early. The woman who'd been abandoned at a gas station during Hurricane Delilah might have been devastated by the end of her marriage. The woman completing advanced tactical training recognized it as the natural conclusion of a relationship that had required her to become smaller rather than encouraging her to grow. 3 days later, I received divorce papers via overnight delivery. Derek had filed for dissolution of marriage, citing irreconcilable differences, with a property settlement that was more generous than I'd expected. Apparently, his eagerness to end the marriage outweighed his interest in punitive financial arrangement. I signed the papers without regret and returned them the same day. After 8 years of marriage that had gradually diminished my sense of possibility, I was finally free to discover what I could become, when no one was asking me to be less than I was. 6 months after Global Crisis Management welcomed me as their newest senior consultant, I was standing in the operations center of a temporary command post in Bangladesh, coordinating flood relief efforts that spanned 3 provinces and involved 12 international aid organizations. The monsoon season had brought unprecedented rainfall that displaced over 2 million people and created humanitarian challenges that required exactly the kind of strategic coordination I'd been training for. My role involved managing resource allocation between refugee camps, coordinating medical supply distribution across flood-damaged infrastructure, and maintaining communication between Bangladeshi government officials, international donors, and field teams operating in remote areas. The work was exhausting and deeply satisfying in ways I'd never experienced during my years of suburban domestic life. The compensation was everything Rodriguez had promised and more. My base salary alone was triple what I'd earned in Florida, with substantial bonuses for international deployments and complex crisis management. But the financial security was secondary to the profound sense of purpose that came from using my skills to address genuine human need during emergency situations. Dr. Rashida Khan, the Bangladeshi physician who served as medical coordinator for our operation, had become both a colleague and friend during the 6 weeks I'd been deployed to the flood zone. She possessed the kind of calm competence under pressure that I recognized from my military service, combined with cultural knowledge and language skills that made our international coordination efforts possible. Natalie, the supply convoy from Dhaka, is reporting delays due to bridge damage near Sylhet. Can you coordinate alternative routing while I handle the medical supply shortage at Camp 7? Already on it, Rashida. I've contacted the engineering team about temporary bridge access, and I'm working with the logistics coordinator in Chittagong to arrange helicopter transport for critical supplies. The ability to anticipate problems and coordinate solutions across multiple agencies had become second nature during my months with Global Crisis Management. Every deployment presented unique challenges that required adapting standard procedures to local conditions, cultural considerations, and resource constraints. The work demanded exactly the kind of strategic thinking and tactical flexibility that had been suppressed during my marriage, but flourished in environments where competence was valued over accommodation. My personal life had also undergone transformation during the months since my divorce was finalized. I'd purchased a small condominium near Fort Liberty that served as my base between deployments, a space that belonged entirely to me and reflected my priorities rather than someone else's aesthetic preferences. The walls were covered with maps from various missions, photographs from deployments, and certifications from specialized training programs I'd completed during brief periods between assignments. Amanda Cross had become my closest friend and occasional roommate when our deployment schedules aligned. She'd accepted a position with Meridian Defense Solutions that involved similar crisis management work, and our friendship had deepened through shared experiences of rediscovering professional identity after personal upheaval. You know what I realized the other day? Amanda had said during one of our rare evenings at home between deployments, I can't even remember what I used to worry about before I started doing work that actually mattered. All those years of caring about social drama and relationship status and whether people approved of my choices seem completely meaningless now. Her observation captured something I'd been thinking about during quiet moments in Bangladesh. The woman who'd been abandoned at a gas station had been consumed with managing other people's expectations and maintaining relationships that required her to diminish herself. The woman coordinating international humanitarian relief was focused on solving problems and serving communities, finding satisfaction in competence rather than compliance. But my contentment with this new life was about to be disrupted by news from home that would test everything I'd learned about standing my ground when challenged. Rachel called me during a brief break between coordination meetings, her voice carrying the kind of tension that immediately put me on alert. "Nat, I need to warn you about something. Derek's been calling me repeatedly asking about your whereabouts and work schedule. He seems obsessed with tracking your movements, and frankly, it's making me uncomfortable." "What kind of questions is he asking?" "Everything. Where you're deployed, when you're coming back to the States, what kind of work you're doing, how much money you're making. He's also been asking about your living situation and whether you're involved with anyone romantically." The information was troubling but not entirely surprising. During our divorce proceedings, Derek had made several comments suggesting he viewed my career success as temporary rebellion rather than permanent transformation. His apparent belief that I would eventually return to him once the novelty of challenging work wore off had been evident in his refusal to divide certain assets and his insistence on maintaining connections to mutual friends. "Has he mentioned any specific plans or intentions?" "That's what worries me, Nat. Yesterday he said something about bringing you back to reality and helping you remember what's actually important. He also mentioned that he's been researching your company and the kind of work you do." It sounded almost threatening. Derek's behavior suggested he was having difficulty accepting the finality of our divorce and the extent of my professional transformation. The man who'd abandoned me during a hurricane evacuation couldn't reconcile his memory of a dependent, accommodating wife with reports of a successful international consultant who'd built an independent life without his involvement. More concerning was his apparent research into my work with global crisis management. The nature of our operations required security clearances and confidentiality protocols that made detailed information about our activities sensitive. Derek's attempts to track my movements and understand my professional responsibilities could potentially compromise operational security in ways that affected not just me, but entire relief operations. I contacted Helen Morrison, GCM's security coordinator, to report Derek's behavior and request guidance on appropriate protective measures. Helen was a former Secret Service agent who specialized in threat assessment and personal security for personnel operating in high-risk environments. "Natalie, this pattern of behavior raises several red flags. Ex-spouses who become obsessed with tracking their former partner's professional activities often escalate to more intrusive or threatening behavior. Combined with his apparent research into classified operations, this could become a security issue that affects more than just your personal safety. What kind of measures should I consider?" "First, we'll implement enhanced operational security protocols for your communications and travel arrangements. Second, we'll coordinate with local law enforcement in areas where you maintain residence to ensure they're aware of potential harassment issues. Third, we'll provide you with emergency communication equipment that allows immediate contact with both company security and emergency services." The security briefing was sobering but not panic-inducing. My military training and months of crisis management work had taught me to assess threats rationally and implement appropriate countermeasures without allowing fear to dictate decisions. Derek's obsessive behavior was concerning, but it was also a problem that could be managed through proper planning and professional support. 2 weeks later, I returned to North Carolina for a brief period between deployments, looking forward to rest and preparation for an upcoming assignment in tornado-damaged areas of Oklahoma. The condominium felt welcoming after weeks of temporary accommodations in Bangladesh, and I was anticipating a quiet weekend of domestic routine before diving into preparation for the next mission. That anticipation was shattered when I discovered Derek waiting in the parking lot outside my building, sitting in his BMW and obviously prepared for confrontation. His presence at my home represented a significant escalation of the harassment behavior Rachel had reported, and it immediately triggered security protocols Helen had established for exactly these situations. I remained in my rental car and activated the emergency communication device that would alert both GCM security and local law enforcement to my situation. Then I called Derek's phone, preferring to manage the confrontation remotely rather than provide him with the face-to-face interaction he was obviously seeking. Derek, you need to leave my property immediately. Your presence here constitutes harassment, and I've already contacted security personnel. Natalie, we need to talk. I've learned some very interesting things about your new career and the kind of work you're actually doing. I think you'll want to hear what I have to say. His tone carried a smugness that suggested he believed he'd discovered information that would somehow undermine my professional credibility or force me to reconsider our relationship. The implication that he'd conducted research into classified operations was deeply troubling from a security perspective and indicated a level of obsession that went far beyond normal divorce-related conflict. Derek, anything you want to communicate can be handled through our attorney. Leave now or I'll have you removed by law enforcement. I'm not going anywhere until you hear what I've discovered about your employer and the real nature of these missions you think are so important. Did you know that Global Crisis Management has contracts with some very questionable organizations? Did you know that some of your humanitarian missions have been covers for intelligence gathering operations? His accusations were designed to undermine my confidence in the work I'd found so meaningful, to suggest that I'd been naive about the organizations I served and the missions I'd committed to. But months of working with GCM had given me direct knowledge of our operations, oversight procedures, and ethical guidelines. Derek's claims sounded like conspiracy theories rather than legitimate concerns, likely gathered from unreliable internet sources by someone desperate to find flaws in my new life. Derek, you have no knowledge of my work, my employer, or my professional responsibility. Your attempts to research classified operations constitute potential violations of federal law. Leave immediately. I'm not leaving until you acknowledge what you've gotten yourself into. These people aren't heroes, Natalie. They're mercenaries who use humanitarian cover for military operations. You're not saving lives, you're supporting American imperialism in developing countries. His words revealed both his desperation to discredit my work and his fundamental mental misunderstanding of international humanitarian operations. The flood relief efforts in Bangladesh had involved 12 nations working together to address human suffering caused by natural disaster. The tornado response in Oklahoma would involve coordinating resources for American communities affected by severe weather. Neither operation had any connection to military objectives or intelligence gathering, but Derek's presence at my home and his apparent willingness to make false accusations about classified operations had crossed lines that required immediate professional intervention. I contacted Helen Morrison directly, reporting the escalation and requesting immediate support. Natalie, stay in your vehicle and maintain distance. We have a response team 15 minutes from your location, and local law enforcement is being notified. Do not engage with him directly unless absolutely necessary for your safety. The next 15 minutes felt longer than some of the crisis operations I'd managed during international deployment. Derek remained in his car, occasionally making phone calls and gesturing in ways that suggested growing agitation. Several neighbors had emerged from their homes, apparently curious about the unusual activity in our normally quiet parking area. When the GCM security team arrived, their response was swift and professional. 2 agents approached Derek's vehicle while a third remained with me to ensure my safety and coordinate with arriving law enforcement. The lead agent, a woman named Sarah Chen, who specialized in protective operations, handled the situation with the kind of calm authority I recognized from my military service. Sir, you're on private property without permission and have been asked to leave by the resident. You need to vacate this area immediately or face trespassing charges. Derek's response revealed the depth of his delusion about his rights and my obligations. I'm her husband. I have every right to be here and discuss her irresponsible career choice. Sir, according to our information, you're her former husband with no legal standing regarding her residence or career decisions. You need to leave now. The confrontation that followed was both embarrassing and illuminating. Derek attempted to argue with professional security personnel about his non-existent rights while making increasingly outrageous claims about my work and character. His behavior demonstrated the entitled mindset that had characterized our entire marriage, the assumption that his disapproval should somehow override my autonomy and professional judgment. Local law enforcement arrived as Derek was being escorted to his vehicle, their presence ensuring that his departure was both immediate and documented. The officers took statements from all parties and issued a formal trespass warning that would make any future appearances at my residence subject to immediate arrest. But Derek's final words as he was escorted away revealed that this confrontation was unlikely to be the end of his interference. "This isn't over, Natalie. People need to know what kind of organization you're working for and what you're really doing overseas. The truth about your missions will come out eventually." His threat suggested escalation beyond personal harassment toward potential interference with my professional responsibilities. The implications were serious enough that Helen Morrison recommended implementing enhanced security protocols for my upcoming deployment to Oklahoma. "Natalie, his behavior pattern suggests he may attempt to contact your deployment location or interfere with your work directly. We're going to coordinate with the Oklahoma operation to ensure appropriate security measures are in place." The prospect of Derek's obsession affecting my professional responsibilities was infuriating in ways that his personal harassment hadn't. My work with tornado-affected communities in Oklahoma involved coordinating relief efforts for families who'd lost their homes and possessions to severe weather. The mission required focus and competence that could be compromised by personal distractions or security concerns. More fundamentally, Derek's attempts to undermine my career represented the same controlling behavior that had characterized our marriage, updated for circumstances he couldn't directly influence. He couldn't make me smaller by limiting my ambitions anymore, so he was attempting to discredit my achievements and sabotage my professional relationships. The Oklahoma deployment began 2 weeks later with enhanced security measures that felt both necessary and slightly surreal. GCM had coordinated with local law enforcement to monitor potential interference, and my communication protocols included regular check-ins with company security personnel. The precautions were professional and unobtrusive, but they served as constant reminders that Derek's obsession continued to affect my life in ways I couldn't entirely control. The tornado damage in southern Oklahoma was extensive, with entire neighborhoods reduced to debris fields and thousands of families displaced to temporary shelter. My role involved coordinating resource distribution between FEMA, state emergency management, local volunteer organizations, and federal agencies, while ensuring that assistance reached the most vulnerable populations efficiently. The work was demanding and deeply satisfying, requiring exactly the kind of multi-agency coordination I'd been training for throughout my career transformation. Days started before dawn with briefings from meteorologists and damage assessment teams, continued through 18-hour shifts, managing supply distribution and shelter coordination, and ended with evening planning sessions that prepared for the next day's challenge. My team included Jennifer Walsh, a FEMA logistics specialist with 15 years of disaster response experience, and Captain Maria Santos, an Oklahoma National Guard officer who specialized in emergency transportation and security. Both women brought expertise that complemented my strategic coordination skills, and working with them reminded me why I'd been drawn to this field. "Natalie, your ability to see connections between different response efforts is exactly what these operations need," Jennifer observed during a brief break between coordination meetings. "Most people get overwhelmed by the complexity and focus on their individual pieces. You somehow keep track of how everything fits together." 3 weeks into the Oklahoma deployment, Derek's harassment escalated in ways that threatened not just my personal safety but the security of relief operations, affecting thousands of tornado survivors. Helen Morrison contacted me with information that transformed his behavior from annoying distraction to genuine security threat. "Natalie, we've detected attempts to access your communication systems and deployment location through social engineering attacks on GCM personnel. Someone has been calling our offices claiming to be a family member with emergency information, attempting to gather details about your current assignment. Are you certain it's Derek? The voice profiles match recordings from your confrontation in North Carolina, and the caller information requests are consistent with the research pattern your sister reported. More concerning, we've identified attempts to contact local media in the Oklahoma operation area, with claims about impropriety in federal disaster response." Derek's escalation to potential media manipulation represented a threat that extended far beyond personal harassment. Disaster response operations required public trust and media cooperation to function effectively, False allegations about impropriety or mismanagement could undermine community confidence in relief efforts while disrupting coordination between agencies. The implications were serious enough that GCM implemented emergency security protocols typically reserved for operations in hostile international environments. My communication systems were upgraded to military-grade encryption, my movements were coordinated with federal law enforcement, and my living arrangements were shifted to secure facilities rather than standard temporary housing. Captain Santos, who'd been briefed on the security situation, approached me with the kind of direct concern I appreciated from military colleagues. "Natalie, this level of harassment is beyond normal domestic dispute. If this individual is willing to interfere with federal disaster response operations, he's demonstrating escalation patterns that could become dangerous. Have you considered requesting protective services?" The suggestion of protective services felt like acknowledgement that Derek's behavior had moved beyond harassment into territory that required law enforcement intervention. But it also represented exactly the kind of professional support that allowed me to focus on my mission responsibilities rather than personal safety concerns. That evening, I received a call from Rachel that confirmed my worst fears about Derek's intentions and escalation timeline. Derek contacted a reporter from the Jacksonville newspaper claiming he has information about corruption in international aid organizations. He specifically mentioned your name and work with global crisis management. The reporter called me for comment, and I referred them to your attorney, but Derek seems convinced he can damage your career through media attention. Derek's willingness to make false public accusations represented the final escalation in a pattern of behavior that had progressed from personal harassment to threats against my professional reputation and operational security. His actions could potentially compromise not just my career, but ongoing relief operations that served vulnerable communities. More importantly, his behavior demonstrated the depth of his inability to accept my autonomy and success. The man who'd abandoned me during a hurricane evacuation couldn't tolerate my transformation into a competent professional whose work was valued by respected organizations. His attacks on my career were really attacks on my right to exist independently of his control and approval. The next morning brought news that would test everything I'd learned about crisis management and personal resilience. Helen Morrison called with information that Derek's harassment had escalated to direct interference with federal operations. "Natalie," Derek Harper contacted the Oklahoma Emergency Management Office, claiming to have information about security violations in your background investigation. He's alleging that you've misrepresented your qualifications and that your security clearance should be revoked pending investigation. The false allegations were serious enough to trigger review procedures that could temporarily suspend my participation in federal operations, while background investigations were updated. Even though the claims were groundless, the administrative process could take weeks or months to resolve, effectively sabotaging my career during the review period. But Derek had made a crucial miscalculation in his escalation strategy. By targeting federal operations and making false claims about security clearances, he'd moved from domestic harassment into territory that involved federal law enforcement agencies with substantial resources and investigative capability. FBI Special Agent Michael Rodriguez contacted me within hours of Derek's call to Oklahoma Emergency Management, beginning an investigation that would finally hold Derek accountable for months of escalating harassment and interference. Harper, making false claims about federal security clearances, constitutes a serious federal offense, especially when those claims are designed to interfere with ongoing emergency response operations. We're opening a formal investigation into Harper's activities and implementing protective measures for your safety and operational security. The FBI investigation moved with surprising speed, aided by months of documented harassment, security reports from GCM, and Derek's own electronic communications that revealed the extent of his research into classified operations. Within days, federal agents had gathered evidence of multiple criminal violations, including harassment, attempted interference with federal operations, and false statements regarding security clearances. The protection offered by federal law enforcement was comprehensive and professional, allowing me to focus on my Oklahoma responsibilities without constant concern about Derek's next escalation. More importantly, the investigation validated everything I'd learned about standing my ground when challenged by people who couldn't accept my autonomy and success. 1 week later, Derek Harper was arrested at his home in Florida on federal charges related to harassment and interference with federal operations. The arrest came as I was coordinating final resource distribution for tornado survivors, bringing Derek's campaign of escalation to an end, just as my mission in Oklahoma was reaching successful completion. But Derek's arrest was only the beginning of consequences that would teach him exactly how much his former wife had changed since their divorce, and how many powerful allies she'd gained during her transformation from abandoned housewife to respected crisis management professional. Derek spent exactly 18 hours in federal custody before his attorney arranged bail, but those 18 hours gave me the breathing room I needed to complete the Oklahoma mission without his interference. The tornado relief operation concluded successfully, with resource distribution reaching every affected community and shelter coordination transitioning smoothly to long-term recovery phases, managed by local agencies. More importantly, Derek's arrest had triggered a federal investigation that revealed the full scope of his obsessive behavior over the past months. FBI forensic analysis of his computer systems uncovered extensive research into my deployment, attempts to access confidential information about GCM operations, and detailed planning for what he'd apparently believed would be a campaign to destroy my career and force my return to our previous domestic arrangement. Special Agent Rodriguez briefed me on their findings during my final day in Oklahoma, painting a picture of escalation that was both disturbing and revelatory about the mindset I'd escaped by choosing professional growth over marital accommodation. Miss Harper's digital communications reveal a pattern of behavior consistent with obsessive control disorders, often seen in domestic abuse cases. His research into your work activities goes far beyond normal concern for an ex-spouse's welfare. He'd compiled detailed files on your colleagues, your deployment schedules, and even attempted to map your international travel patterns. What kind of charges is he facing? Federal harassment across state lines, attempted interference with federal emergency operations, making false statements to federal agencies, and potentially charges related to attempted unauthorized access to classified information. The prosecution is taking this seriously because his actions could have compromised ongoing relief efforts affecting thousands of people. The federal charges carried potential prison sentences that would effectively end Derek's corporate finance career while establishing legal precedents that protected me from future harassment. But more satisfying than the legal consequences was the recognition that Derek's attempts to diminish my achievements had instead drawn attention to the significance and value of my work from law enforcement agencies, federal prosecutors, and congressional representatives who'd been briefed on the case. I returned to North Carolina with a sense of completion that went beyond successful mission accomplishment. The Oklahoma deployment had tested my abilities under pressure, while Derek's harassment campaign had ultimately demonstrated my resilience and the strength of the professional network I'd built. Both challenges had been met successfully, leaving me more confident than ever in the career path I'd chosen. Global Crisis Management offered me a promotion to regional coordinator following my Oklahoma performance, a position that would involve overseeing crisis response operations across multiple states while supervising teams of junior consultants. The role represented both professional advancement and validation that my combination of tactical training and strategic thinking was valued at the highest levels of the organization. But accepting the promotion would require a permanent relocation to GCM's regional headquarters in Denver, a move that would complete my geographical separation from any reminders of my previous life while opening opportunities for advancement toward senior executive positions within the company. The decision should have been straightforward given my satisfaction with crisis management work and the substantial compensation increase the promotion offered. But as I prepared to accept the position, I received an unexpected communication that opened possibilities I hadn't considered. Colonel Sarah Martinez, the Spanish military liaison who'd observed my performance during international training exercises, contacted me through official diplomatic channels with an opportunity that seemed almost too extraordinary to be real. Harper, I've been authorized by the European Union Emergency Response Coordination Center to offer you a position as Senior Operations Coordinator for International Humanitarian Mission. The role would involve deploying to crisis zones worldwide, coordinating multinational response efforts, and developing strategic protocols for complex emergency scenarios. The European Union position represented everything I'd discovered I was capable of, scaled to global significance. The work would involve coordinating response efforts for natural disasters, refugee crises, and humanitarian emergencies across multiple continents, while working with governments, international organizations, and civilian agencies from dozens of countries. What would the timeline and compensation structure look like? The position begins with 6 months of specialized training in Brussels, followed by immediate deployment to crisis zones based on global emergency priority. Compensation includes base salary equivalent to senior executive positions in major corporations, plus substantial deployment bonuses and comprehensive benefits for international service. The opportunity represented not just career advancement, but the chance to work at the highest levels of international humanitarian response, coordinating efforts that could affect millions of people during major emergencies. It was the kind of meaningful work I'd been searching for without knowing it existed, utilizing every aspect of my military training, crisis management experience, and strategic coordination skill. But accepting the European position would require another major life transition, this time to international service that would make my transformation from abandoned housewife to global humanitarian coordinator complete and irreversible. I requested 2 weeks to consider both opportunities, using the time to visit Fort Liberty and discuss career decisions with Rodriguez, Mackenzie, and Amanda Cross. Their perspectives helped clarify my thinking about what I wanted from the next phase of my professional development. Natalie, you've got options that most people in this field never see, Rodriguez observed during our conversation. The question isn't which position is better objectively, but which one aligns with your long-term goals and personal values. What do you think my long-term trajectory should be? That's not for me to decide, but I will say this. You've demonstrated capabilities that could take you to the highest levels of emergency management and international coordination. Don't limit yourself based on what feels safe or familiar. Mackenzie's perspective focused on the strategic implications of each choice for my continued professional development. The GCM promotion gives you domestic leadership experience and executive training that could be valuable regardless of your ultimate career direction. The EU position throws you into the deep end of international coordination, but might accelerate your development faster than any traditional advancement path. Amanda's advice was characteristically direct and personally focused. Natalie, 18 months ago you were a logistics coordinator in Florida whose husband abandoned her during a hurricane. Now you're choosing between senior positions with 2 of the most respected emergency management organizations in the world. Stop overthinking this and choose the option that excites you most. Her observation reminded me that career decisions should be based on potential for growth and satisfaction, rather than minimizing risk or maintaining familiar circumstance. The woman who'd been abandoned at a gas station had made choices based on safety and accommodation. The woman choosing between global leadership opportunities should make decisions based on maximizing her impact and professional fulfillment. I accepted the European Union position, submitting my resignation to Global Crisis Management, with gratitude for the opportunities they'd provided while explaining my decision to pursue international humanitarian coordination. Helen Morrison's response captured the professional respect I'd earned during my time with the company. Natalie, this is exactly the kind of career progression we hope to see from our best people. You've outgrown what we can offer here, and the EU position will utilize your skills at a level that matches your capabilities. We'd be honored to serve as a reference for your security clearance upgrade. The 6 months of specialized training in Brussels exceeded even my optimistic expectations for challenge and professional development. The European Union Emergency Response Coordination Center operated at a level of sophistication and international integration that made my previous crisis management experience seem like preparation for this higher level of responsibility. Training covered everything from diplomatic protocol for working with multiple governments to advanced coordination techniques for managing response efforts across cultural and linguistic barriers. I learned to coordinate helicopter evacuations in 5 languages, manage supply distribution for refugee populations numbering in the hundreds of thousands, and navigate political complexities that could affect humanitarian access in conflict zones. My fellow trainees represented the best emergency management professionals from across Europe and allied nations, each bringing specialized expertise that enhanced the overall program. Dr. Elena Kowalski from Poland brought experience in medical response to mass casualty events. Captain Jean-Luc Dubois from France specialized in logistics coordination for complex military-civilian operations. Sarah McBride from Ireland had managed refugee resettlement operations across 3 continents. Working alongside such accomplished professionals reminded me daily that I'd found my professional home in an environment where competence was expected rather than exceptional, where strategic thinking was valued rather than threatened, and where ambition was encouraged rather than limited by other people's insecurities. The training culminated in a comprehensive exercise that simulated response to a major earthquake affecting multiple countries, requiring coordination between European Union agencies, NATO military units, United Nations humanitarian organizations, and civilian emergency services from affected nations. My role was serving as primary operations coordinator for the overall response effort, managing activities that involved over 300 personnel from 15 different countries. The exercise lasted 2 weeks and required managing every aspect of international emergency response, while adapting to constantly evolving scenarios designed to test our ability to coordinate complex operations under extreme pressure. When simulated aftershocks triggered secondary disasters, I reorganized resource allocation to address multiple crisis sites simultaneously. When political tensions threatened to disrupt international cooperation, I coordinated with diplomatic representatives to maintain operational focus. When communication systems failed across multiple countries, I established backup protocols that maintained coordination between all response elements. The successful completion of the exercise earned recognition from senior officials throughout the European emergency management community, but the feedback that meant most came from my fellow trainees, who'd worked alongside me through 2 weeks of intensive operational coordination. Natalie, you have this gift for seeing the strategic picture while managing tactical details, Dr. Kowalski observed. Most people can do one or the other effectively, but you somehow integrate both perspectives seamlessly. Captain Dubois nodded agreement. Your coordination style brings out the best performance from everyone involved. People trust your judgment immediately, which is essential when you're working with teams that haven't trained together. 2 months after completing training, I received my first deployment assignment, coordinating international response to devastating floods in Central Europe that had displaced over 500,000 people and required coordination between 7 different national governments. The mission would test every aspect of my training while establishing my credibility as a senior coordinator in the international humanitarian community. But as I prepared for deployment to Prague, where I would establish the primary coordination center for flood response operations, I received news from the United States that Derek's legal troubles had escalated far beyond the federal charges stemming from his harassment campaign. Rachel called with information that Derek's arrest had triggered investigations into his corporate activities that revealed financial irregularities potentially affecting his employer and several major clients. Nate, Derek's company discovered that he'd been using work resources and company time to research your activities and plan his harassment campaign. They've fired him and are considering legal action to recover costs. Worse, some of his clients are reviewing contracts because his behavior reflects poorly on the firm's professional standards. The news that Derek's obsession with controlling my life had destroyed his own career was both satisfying and sobering. The man who'd abandoned me during a hurricane, confident that I'd be helpless without his guidance, had ultimately sabotaged his own professional reputation through his inability to accept my independence and success. But more interesting was Rachel's report that Derek had been making statements to anyone who would listen about his regret over ending our marriage and his desire to make things right with me. He's telling people that he made a mistake letting you go, and that he understands now what an accomplished woman you've become. It's like he's trying to rewrite history to make himself look like the supportive husband who encouraged your career development. Derek's revisionist narrative was both predictable and irrelevant to my current circumstance. The man who'd spent months trying to sabotage my career was now attempting to claim credit for my success when it became clear that his harassment had only drawn attention to my accomplishments and professional value. I arrived in Prague to establish flood response coordination, as the highest-ranking American representative in a joint operation involving multiple European governments, NATO emergency response units, and international humanitarian organizations. The scope of the operation was unlike anything I'd experienced, requiring coordination of resource distribution across 3 countries, while managing political sensitivities that could affect long-term regional cooperation. My first week involved establishing communication protocols between Czech, Slovak, and Austrian emergency services, while coordinating with European Union disaster response teams and NATO logistics units. The complexity of managing operations across multiple languages, governmental systems, and military structures required exactly the kind of strategic thinking and diplomatic sensitivity my training had emphasized. The work was demanding and deeply satisfying, representing the culmination of every aspect of my professional development since being abandoned in Florida. Days began with briefings from meteorological services and damage assessment teams, continued through coordination meetings with governmental representatives and military commanders, and concluded with strategic planning sessions that prepared for the next day's operation. Pavel Novak, the Czech emergency coordinator who served as my primary governmental liaison, had initially been skeptical about working with an American consultant whose background included relatively recent transition from military service. But 3 weeks of successful coordination had earned his respect and confidence in ways that validated my decision to pursue international humanitarian work. Harper, your ability to coordinate complex operations while respecting national sovereignty and cultural differences is exactly what international emergency response requires. Most Americans approach these missions with assumptions about their methods being superior to local knowledge. You've demonstrated genuine partnership in ways that strengthen rather than threaten our operational capability. 1 month into the Prague deployment, I received an unexpected call that Derek had attempted to contact the European Union Emergency Response Coordination Center, claiming to have important information about my background and qualifications for international service. Colonel Martinez, who'd been notified of Derek's call through diplomatic security channels, briefed me on his latest attempt to interfere with my professional responsibilities. Harper, your former husband, contacted our Brussels headquarters, claiming that your security clearances were obtained through misrepresentation and that your military service record contained discrepancies that should disqualify you from international humanitarian work. What kind of response did he receive? Our security personnel informed him that any concerns about American personnel serving in European operations should be directed to appropriate United States agencies, and that his call was being reported to federal law enforcement as potential interference with international humanitarian missions. Derek's attempt to sabotage my international career represented the same pattern of escalation that had led to his arrest in the United States, but with potentially more serious consequences, given the diplomatic implications of interfering with joint international operations. More importantly, his continued obsession with controlling my career demonstrated his complete inability to accept that the woman he'd abandoned during a hurricane had not only survived his abandonment, but thrived in ways that exceeded anything she could have achieved while accommodating his limitation securities. The Prague operation concluded successfully 6 weeks after my arrival, with flood recovery transitioning to long-term reconstruction efforts, managed by national governments and regional development organizations. My coordination of the international response had earned recognition from senior officials throughout the European emergency management community and established my reputation as a senior coordinator capable of managing complex multinational operations. But as I prepared to return to Brussels for briefings on my next deployment assignment, I received news that Derek's harassment had escalated one final time in ways that would bring our post-divorce conflict to a definitive conclusion. FBI Special Agent Rodriguez contacted me with information that Derek had violated his bail conditions by attempting to travel to Europe and interfere with my international assignments. Mr. Harper was detained at Dulles International Airport, attempting to board a flight to Brussels. His luggage contained detailed files on your current deployment, maps of your operational area, and what appears to be a plan to disrupt your work by making false allegations, to European media about American humanitarian operations. Derek's attempt to travel to Europe and sabotage my international career represented the final escalation in a pattern of behavior that had progressed from personal harassment to interference with federal operations, to attempted disruption of diplomatic humanitarian missions. But his detention at the airport also provided an opportunity to demonstrate exactly how much power and protection I'd gained during my transformation from abandoned housewife to respected international humanitarian. Colonel Martinez contacted me within hours of Derek's arrest with news that the European Union was taking his attempted interference with international operations seriously enough to coordinate with United States authorities on additional charges. Ms. Harper, the European Union considers attempts to disrupt international humanitarian missions as threats to European security interests. We're coordinating with American federal prosecutors to ensure appropriate charges are filed for Ms. Harper's attempted interference with joint international operations. The coordination between American and European authorities represented exactly the kind of professional protection and institutional support that my work had earned. Derek's attempts to diminish my achievements had instead drawn attention to the value and significance of international humanitarian coordination, while demonstrating the respect I'd gained from colleagues and supervisors across multiple countries. 2 days later, I received a call from Amanda Cross with news that perfectly captured the irony of Derek's situation. "Natalie, you're not going to believe that Derek's been trying to get character references for his legal defense, and he contacted your old supervisor at Meridian Defense Solutions, asking them to testify about your supposed instability and poor judgment. Their response was to offer you a senior executive position if you ever want to return to the United States." Derek's attempts to undermine my professional reputation had backfired so completely that former employers were competing to recruit me for senior positions, while his own career lay in ruins due to the harassment campaign he'd believed would force my return to dependence and accommodation. But the most satisfying news came from Rachel, who reported that Derek had finally begun to understand the magnitude of his miscalculation in abandoning me during Hurricane Delilah. Natalie, Derek's attorney, contacted me asking if I thought you might be willing to provide a character reference for his sentencing hearing. Apparently, he's realized that having an internationally recognized humanitarian coordinator testify on his behalf might help with the federal judge. The irony was perfect. The man who'd abandoned me at a gas station during a hurricane, confident that I'd be helpless without his guidance, was now hoping that my professional accomplishments and international reputation might help mitigate his punishment for attempting to sabotage the career he'd inadvertently launched through his cruelty. "What did you tell his attorney?" "I told them that you were currently deployed to European flood relief operations, and probably too busy saving lives to worry about helping the man who tried to destroy your career." 1 week later, I received my next assignment from the European Union Emergency Response Coordination Center, coordinating international response to earthquake damage in Turkey that required managing operations involving NATO military units, United Nations, humanitarian organizations, and emergency services from 8 different countries. The assignment represented another opportunity to work at the highest levels of international emergency management, while continuing to build my reputation as a senior coordinator capable of managing complex, multinational operations. But more importantly, it demonstrated that Derek's attempts to interfere with my career had failed completely, while my professional trajectory continued toward increasing responsibility and recognition. As I prepared for deployment to Turkey, I reflected on the journey that had begun 18 months earlier when Derek abandoned me during Hurricane Delilah. The woman who'd been left at a gas station had been dependent, uncertain, and defined by other people's expectations and limitations. The woman preparing to coordinate international earthquake response was confident, capable, and recognized as a leader by colleagues and supervisors across multiple continents. Derek's attempt to teach me a lesson about dependence had instead taught me about my own resilience and capability. His abandonment had forced me to rediscover strengths I'd forgotten I possessed and pursue opportunities I'd never imagined were available. His harassment had ultimately drawn attention to my accomplishments while demonstrating the professional network and institutional support my work had earned. The transformation was complete and irreversible. Derek could continue his legal battles and revisionist narratives, but he could no longer affect my career trajectory or personal autonomy. The woman he'd abandoned during a hurricane had not only survived his cruelty, but transformed it into the foundation for a life that exceeded anything she could have achieved while accommodating his limitations. 6 months later, Derek Harper was sentenced to 2 years in federal prison for harassment, interference with federal operations, and attempted disruption of international humanitarian missions. The judge's sentencing statement included observations about the particularly egregious nature of attempting to sabotage emergency response operations that served vulnerable communities during disaster. I was coordinating tsunami relief efforts in the Philippines when Rachel called with news of Derek's sentencing, my third major international deployment in 8 months with the European Union Emergency Response Coordination Center. The judge said Derek's behavior represented exactly the kind of controlling domestic abuse that federal harassment laws were designed to address, made worse by his attempts to weaponize his ex-wife's professional success against her. The sentence includes mandatory counseling and permanent restraining orders that prevent any future contact or research into your activity. Derek's imprisonment marked the definitive end of his ability to affect my life while validating everything I'd learned about standing my ground when challenged by people who couldn't accept my autonomy and growth. But more satisfying than Derek's legal consequences was the recognition that his cruelty had accidentally launched me into exactly the kind of meaningful work I'd been seeking without knowing it existed. The gas station abandonment that was supposed to teach me about dependence had instead taught me about resilience. The harassment campaign designed to undermine my confidence had drawn attention to my capability. The attempts to sabotage my career had backfired so completely that international organizations were competing to recruit me for senior positions. As I stood in the operations center of our tsunami relief command post, coordinating response efforts that would affect hundreds of thousands of people across multiple islands, I realized that Derek's expression when he learned about my transformation was indeed priceless. But it was priceless because it represented his recognition that the woman he'd tried to control and diminish had become someone whose capabilities and accomplishments exceeded anything he could comprehend or affect. The hurricane winds that had brought Derek and me together 18 months earlier had ultimately blown us in completely different directions. His had led to federal prison and career destruction. Mine had led to international recognition and meaningful work that utilized every aspect of my capabilities while serving communities in their greatest moments of need. Sometimes the cruelest abandonment becomes the greatest liberation, and the people who try to break us accidentally set us free to discover what we're truly capable of becoming. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.